everyone, it's Miss Bree. We're continuing to read a series of unfortunate events, The Bad Beginning. So we were almost finished with chapter 4, so I'm going to pick up where we left off and then read chapter 5 as well. If you would like another bed, he said, tomorrow you may go into town and purchase one. You know perfectly well we haven't any money, Klaus said. Of course you do, Count Olaf said, and his voice began to get a little louder. You are inheritors of an enormous fortune. That money, Klaus said, remembering what Mr. Poe said, is not to be used until Violet is of age. Count Olaf's face grew very red. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in one sudden movement, he reached down and struck Klaus across the face. Klaus fell to the floor, his face inches from the eye tattooed on Olaf's ankle. His glasses leaped from his face and skittered into a corner. His left cheek, where Olaf had struck him, felt as if it were on fire. The theater troupe laughed, and a few of them applauded as if Count Olaf had done something very brave instead of something totally despicable. Come on, friends, Count Olaf said to his comrades. We'll be late for our own performance. If I know you, Olaf, said the man with hook hands, you'll figure out a way to get at that Baudelaire money. We'll see, Count Olaf said. But his eyes were shining bright, as if he already had another idea. There was another loud boom as the front door shut behind Count Olaf and his terrible friends, and the Baudelaire children were alone in the kitchen. Violet knelt at Klaus's side, giving him a hug to try to make him feel better. Sonny crawled over to his glasses, picked them up, and brought them to him. Klaus began to cry, not so much from pain, but from rage at the terrible situation they were in. Violet and Sonny cried with him, and they continued weeping as they washed the dishes, and as they blew out the candles in the dining room, and as they changed out of their clothes and lay down to go to sleep, Klaus in the bed, Violet on the floor, Sonny on her little cushion of curtains. The moonlight shone through the window, and if anyone had looked into the Baudelaire orphan's bedroom, they would have seen 3 children crying quietly all night long. Chapter 5. Unless you have been very, very lucky, you have undoubtedly experienced events in your life that have made you cry. So unless you have been very, very lucky, you know that a good, long session of weeping can often make you feel better, even if your circumstances have not changed one bit. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans. Having cried all night, they rose the next morning feeling as if a weight were off their shoulders. The 3 children knew, of course, that they were still in a terrible situation, but they thought they might do something to make it better. The morning's note from Count Olaf ordered them to chop firewood in the backyard, and as Violet and Klaus swung the axe down over each log to break it into smaller pieces, they discussed possible plans of action while Sonny chewed meditatively on a small piece of wood. Clearly, Klaus said, fingering the ugly bruise on his face where Olaf had struck him, we cannot stay here any longer. I would rather take my chances on the streets than live in this terrible place. But who knows what misfortunes would befall us on the streets, Violet pointed out. At least here we would have a roof over our heads. I wish our parents' money could be used now, instead of when you come of age, Klaus said. Then we could buy a castle and live in it with armed guards patrolling the outside to keep out Count Olaf and his troop. And I could have a large inventing studio, Violet said wistfully. She swung the axe down and split a log neatly in 2, filled with gears and pulleys and wires and an elaborate computer system. And I could have a large library, Klaus said, as comfortable as Justice Strauss's, but more enormous. Gebo! Sonny shrieked, which appeared to mean, and I could have lots of things to bite. But in the meantime, Violet said, we have to do something about our predicament. Perhaps Justice Strauss could adopt us, Klaus said. She said we were always welcome in her home, but she meant for a visit, or to use her library, Violet pointed out. She didn't mean to live. Perhaps if we explained our situation, she would agree to adopt us, Klaus said hopefully. But when Violet looked at him, she saw that he knew it was of no use. Adoption is an enormous decision, and not likely to happen impulsively. I'm sure you in your life have occasionally wished to be raised by different people than the ones who are raising you, but knew in your heart that the chances of this were very slim. I think we should go to Mr. Poe, Violet said. He told us when he dropped us here that we could contact him at the bank if we had any questions. We don't really have a question, Klaus said. We have a complaint. He was thinking of Mr. Poe walking toward them at Briny Beach with his terrible message. Even though the fire was of course not Mr. Poe's fault, Klaus was reluctant to see Mr. Poe because he was afraid of getting more bad news. I can't think of anyone else to contact, Violet said. Mr. Poe is in charge of our affairs, and I'm sure if he knew how horrid Count Olaf is, he would take us right out of here. Klaus pictured Mr. Poe arriving in his car and putting the Baudelaire orphans inside to go somewhere else, and felt a stirring of hope. Anywhere would be better than here. Okay, he said, let's get this firewood all chopped and we'll go to the bank. Invigorated by their plan, the Baudelaire orphans swung their axes at an amazing speed, and soon enough they were done chopping firewood and ready to go to the bank. They remember Olaf saying he had a map of the city, and they looked thoroughly for it, but they couldn't find any trace of a map and decided it must be in the tower where they were forbidden to go. So without directions of any sort, the Baudelaire children set off for the city's banking district in hopes of finding Mr. Poe. After walking through the meat district, the flower district, and the sculpture district, the three children arrived at the banking district, pausing to take a refreshing sip of water at the fountain of victorious finance. The banking district consisted of several wide streets with large marble buildings on each side of them, all banks. They went first to Trustworthy Bank, and then to Faithful Savings and Loans, and then to Subservient Financial Services, each time inquiring for Mr. Poe. Finally, a receptionist at Subservient said she knew that Mr. Poe worked down the street at Mortuary Money Management. The building was square and plain. Though once inside, the three orphans were intimidated by the hustle and bustle of the people as they raced around the large, echoey room. Finally, they asked a uniformed guard whether they had arrived at the right place to speak to Mr. Poe, and he led them into a large office with many file cabinets and no windows. "Why, hello," said Mr. Poe in a puzzled tone of voice. He was sitting at a desk covered in typed papers that looked important and boring. "Please come in." "Thank you," said Klaus, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. The Baudelaire youngsters sat down in three large and comfortable chairs. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but had to cough into a handkerchief before he could begin. "I'm very busy today," he said finally, "so I don't have much time to chat. Next time you should call ahead of time when you plan on being in the neighborhood, and I will put some time aside to take you to lunch." "That would be very pleasant," Violet said, "and we're sorry we didn't contact you before we stopped by, but we find ourselves in an urgent situation." "Count Olaf is a madman," Klaus said, getting right to the point. "We cannot stay with him." He struck Klaus across the face. "See his bruise?" Violet said, but just as she said it, one of the telephones rang in a loud, unpleasant wail. "Excuse me," Mr. Poe said, and picked up the phone. "Poe here," he said into the receiver. "What? Yes, 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 yes. No, yes, thank you." He hung up the phone and looked at the Baudelaires as if he had forgotten that they were there. "I'm sorry," Mr. Poe said. "What were you talking about?" "Oh yes, Count Olaf. I'm sorry you don't have a good first impression of him." "He has only provided us with one bed," Klaus said. "He makes us do a great many difficult chores." "Excuse me," Poe said as the telephone rang again. "I'm sorry," he said. "What were you saying about Count Olaf? Making you do chores doesn't sound bad. He calls us orphans. He has terrible friends. He's always asking about our money. Poco." This was from Sonny. Mr. Poe sighed and looked at each of the three children. His face was kind, but it didn't look like he really believed what the Baudelaires were saying. "Are you familiar with the Latin term in loco parentis?" he asked. Violet and Sonny looked at Klaus. The biggest reader of the three, he was the most likely to know vocabulary words and foreign phrases. "Something about trains?" he asked. Maybe Mr. Poe was going to take them by train. Mr. Poe shook his head. "In loco parentis means acting in the role of a parent. It is a legal term and it applies to Count Olaf. Now that you are in his care, the Count may raise you using any methods he sees fit. I'm sorry if your parents did not make you do any household chores, or if you like their friends better than Count Olaf, but these are things you must get used to, as Count Olaf is acting as your parent. Understand?" "But he struck my brother," Violet said. "Look at his face." As Violet spoke, Mr. Poe reached into his pocket for his handkerchief, and covering his mouth, coughed many, many times into it. He coughed so loudly that Violet could not be certain he had heard her. "Whatever Count Olaf has done, there's nothing I can do about it. Your money will be well protected by myself and by the bank, but Count Olaf's parenting techniques are his own business. Now I hate to usher you out post-haste, but I have very much to do." The children just sat there stunned. Mr. Poe looked up and cleared his throat. "Post-haste," he said, means you'll do nothing for us," Violet finished for him. She was shaking with anger and frustration. As one of the phones began ringing, she stood up and walked out of the room, followed by Klaus, who was carrying Sunny. They stalked out of the bank and stood on the street, not knowing what to do next. "What should we do next?" Klaus said sadly. Violet stared up at the sky. She wished she could invent something to take them out of there. "It's getting a bit late," she said. "We might as well just go back and think of something else tomorrow. Perhaps we can stop and see Justice Strauss." "But you said she wouldn't help us," Klaus said. "Not for help. For books." It is very useful when one is young to learn the difference between literally and figuratively. If something happens literally, it actually happens. If something happens figuratively, it feels like it's happening. If you are literally jumping for joy, for instance, it means because you are leaping in the air because you're really happy. If you are figuratively jumping for joy, it means you are so happy that you could jump for joy, but you're saving your energy for other matters. The Baudelaire orphans walked back to Count Olaf's neighborhood and stopped at the home of Justice Strauss, who welcomed them inside and let them choose books from the library. Violet chose several about mechanical inventions, Klaus chose several about wolves, and Sunny found a book with many pictures of teeth. Then they went into their room and crowded together on one bed, reading intently and happily. Figuratively, they escaped from Count Olaf and his miserable existence. They did not literally escape because they were still in his house and vulnerable to his evil in loco parentis ways. But by immersing themselves in their favorite reading topics, they felt far away from their predicament, as if they had escaped. In the situation of the orphans, figuratively escaping was not enough, of course, but at the end of a tiring and hopeless day, it would have to do. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny read their books, and in the back of their minds hoped that soon their figurative escape would eventually turn into a literal one.